For decades, the Cold War was not only fought with weapons, spies, or ideology. It was fought with factories, machines, and the quiet confidence of a nation that could build faster, bigger, and better than anyone else on Earth. While much of the world focused on speeches and threats, something far more decisive was happening behind closed doors, inside massive American industrial complexes that few outsiders were ever meant to see. In this video, you're about to hear a story rarely told in full detail. A story about Soviet engineers and officials who arrived in the United States convinced that American industry was exaggerated propaganda, only to be confronted with a reality so overwhelming that it permanently changed how they viewed the balance of power. What they witnessed wasn't just technology. It was scale, organization, and a level of industrial confidence that the Soviet system simply could not replicate. Welcome to Cold War Archives. On this channel, we explore the hidden moments, overlooked encounters, and quiet realizations that shaped the Cold War behind the scenes. Not the speeches you've heard 1,000 times, but the moments when assumptions collapsed, when rivals understood the true strength of their opponent, sometimes without a single shot being fired. Today's story takes us inside one of those moments. A visit, a tour, and a realization that left even seasoned Soviet professionals stunned. As you listen, pay attention not just to what was built, but to what it represented. Because in the Cold War, production was power. If you enjoy long-form historical storytelling like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment sharing what surprised you most, and feel free to share this video with anyone who appreciates history told without hype, just facts, context, and the weight of reality.
For years, Soviet planners believed they understood the United States. On paper, the numbers seemed manageable. American industry was productive, yes, but in their view, it was inefficient, wasteful, driven by profit rather than discipline. Soviet economic doctrine insisted that centralized planning, once fully optimized, would eventually surpass the chaotic capitalism of the West. This belief was repeated in reports, speeches, and internal memoranda, reinforced by ideology rather than direct experience. Very few Soviet officials had ever seen the heart of American industry with their own eyes, and those who had were often dismissed as being influenced by propaganda or intimidation. That changed gradually during the 1950s and early 1960s, when carefully managed exchanges began to take place. Engineers, trade officials, and technical specialists were allowed to visit American facilities under tightly controlled circumstances. Officially, these visits were meant to promote understanding and cooperation. Unofficially, they were reconnaissance missions. Every machine, every workflow, every logistical decision was observed, measured, and quietly reported back to Moscow. The expectation was not amazement, but confirmation. Confirmation that American industry was impressive, but ultimately fragile, dependent on excess, vulnerable to disruption. What many of those visitors encountered instead was something they had not been prepared for. Not a single breakthrough technology, not one secret machine, but a system. A scale of production so vast that it challenged their assumptions about what was economically possible. Factories that stretched beyond the horizon, where raw materials entered at one end and finished products emerged at the other, in a continuous, almost effortless flow. The sheer physical size of these facilities alone forced a recalculation. These were not showpieces built for visitors. They were working industrial engines, operating day and night, producing at levels that few outside the United States truly understood. In the Soviet Union, industrial output was often concentrated in specialized plants, each responsible for a narrow segment of production. Coordination between them required layers of bureaucracy, approvals, and revisions. Delays were expected. Bottlenecks were normal. In contrast, American factories were often vertically integrated, designed to minimize friction and maximize speed. Components moved along assembly lines with a precision that felt almost automated, even when human labor was involved. Workers did not appear rushed or exhausted. They appeared practiced, confident, and supported by systems designed to make their tasks easier rather than harder. One Soviet engineer, tasked with evaluating machine tool capacity, reportedly spent hours walking the floor of a Midwestern manufacturing plant, counting identical machines arranged in long, orderly rows. In the Soviet system, acquiring even a handful of such machines required months of negotiation and planning. Here, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds, operating simultaneously. Spare parts were readily available. Maintenance crews moved quietly and efficiently, preventing breakdowns before they occurred. Downtime was treated not as an inevitability, but as a problem to be eliminated. What unsettled many visitors most was not the machinery itself, but the logistics behind it. American factories were supplied by a transportation network that functioned with astonishing reliability. Rail lines, highways, and ports moved raw materials across vast distances with minimal delay. Inventory systems ensured that shortages were rare and temporary. Where the Soviet model emphasized stockpiling to guard against uncertainty, the American approach relied on flow, constant movement, constant replenishment. This reduced waste, lowered costs, and increased responsiveness. It was a different philosophy of production, one that trusted systems rather than hoarding. As visits continued, patterns emerged. No single factory explained American industrial strength. It was the repetition of the same principles everywhere. Whether in steel, automobiles, aircraft, or consumer goods, the underlying logic was consistent. Standardization allowed for rapid scaling. Competition encouraged continuous improvement. Profit motives, far from creating chaos, appeared to drive efficiency and innovation. Soviet observers were forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility that the very elements their ideology rejected were the source of American industrial resilience. In private conversations, some visitors admitted their surprise. They had expected waste and disorder. Instead, they found discipline enforced not by decree, but by incentive. Workers understood that efficiency mattered, that quality mattered, and that mistakes had consequences. Management, in turn, invested heavily in training, safety, and process improvement. In private conversations, some visitors admitted their surprise. They had expected waste and disorder. Instead, they found discipline enforced not by decree, but by incentive. Workers understood that efficiency mattered, that quality mattered, and that mistakes had consequences. Management, in turn, invested heavily in training, safety, and process improvement. The relationship between labor and industry, while far from perfect, was dynamic in a way the Soviet system struggled to replicate. Adjustments could be made quickly, without waiting for approval from distant ministries. The psychological impact of these observations was profound. In the Cold War, perception mattered almost as much as reality. Soviet confidence rested on the belief that time was on their side, that planned economies would eventually outperform market-driven ones. Witnessing American industry in action introduced doubt into that equation. If the United States could produce at this scale in peacetime, what would happen in a full mobilization scenario? The memory of World War II loomed large. American factories had once transformed civilian industries into war production almost overnight. Now those same capabilities had not only been preserved, but expanded. Reports sent back to Moscow became increasingly cautious in tone. Praise was often couched in neutral language, but the implications were difficult to ignore. The United States possessed not only advanced technology, but the capacity to reproduce it endlessly. A new design could be turned into thousands of units with remarkable speed. Replacement losses could be absorbed. Innovation cycles were short. In a prolonged confrontation, this mattered more than any single weapon system. Some Soviet officials attempted to downplay what they had seen, arguing that such abundance masked deeper vulnerabilities. They pointed to income inequality, labor disputes, and social unrest as signs of instability. Yet even these critiques acknowledge the underlying strength of the industrial base. Strikes did not halt production indefinitely. Supply chains adapted, markets adjusted. The system bent, but did not break. This adaptability stood in contrast to the rigidity of centralized planning, where small disruptions could cascade into major failures. Over time, these realizations influenced strategic thinking. Emphasis shifted toward areas where parity seemed achievable: missiles, nuclear deterrence, and space technology. Competing head-to-head in broad industrial output appeared increasingly unrealistic. The American advantage was not absolute, but it was deep. It rested on infrastructure built over decades, supported by education systems, financial markets, and a culture that rewarded problem-solving. Replicating this wholesale was not a matter of copying blueprints. It required systemic change. For the American public, much of this remained invisible. Factories were simply part of the landscape, sources of jobs and prosperity. Few paused to consider how closely they were being watched, how their routines and processes were being studied by rivals. Yet these ordinary places played an extraordinary role in the Cold War. They projected power without parades or speeches. Their output spoke for itself. By the late Cold War period, the gap had become clearer. Attempts at reform within the Soviet system acknowledged, implicitly, what earlier visitors had observed firsthand. Efficiency, flexibility, and scale were not weaknesses of capitalism, but strengths. The industrial contest was not won through secrecy alone, but through openness and competition. While the Cold War would ultimately be decided by a complex mix of political, economic, and social factors, the quiet lessons learned on factory floors across America were an important part of that story. The realization that production itself could be a form of deterrence reshaped thinking on both sides. Power was no longer measured solely in divisions or missiles, but in throughput, reliability, and the ability to sustain effort over time. In that arena, the United States held a decisive advantage, one that was difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore once seen. As implications of this industrial reality extended far beyond factory walls. For Soviet strategists, the question was no longer whether the United States possessed advanced technology, but whether it possessed something even more decisive: the ability to recover faster than any rival after disruption. In war planning, this distinction mattered enormously. A system that could absorb losses and replace them rapidly could afford risks that others could not. American industry, as it had been quietly demonstrated, was built not merely for efficiency, but for resilience. This realization forced a subtle but significant shift in how American power was perceived. Military hardware was no longer viewed as static inventory, but as part of a living cycle of production, maintenance, and replacement. Aircraft were not just built. They were supported by an ecosystem of suppliers, logistics hubs, and trained labor that ensured constant readiness. Ships were not merely launched, they were sustained by shipyards capable of continuous output. In contrast, the Soviet system often treated production targets as endpoints rather than stages in an ongoing process. Soviet visitors noted that American factories seemed designed with future expansion in mind. Floor layouts allowed for additional machinery to be installed with minimal disruption. Electrical systems were overbuilt, capable of handling increased loads without major reconstruction. Transportation access was prioritized, with rail spurs and highways integrated directly into industrial sites. These were not improvisations. They were deliberate design choices reflecting a long-term mindset, one that assumed growth rather than scarcity. Equally striking was the relationship between civilian and military production. In the United States, the boundary between the two was remarkably flexible. Civilian manufacturers regularly held contracts that could be converted to defense production if required. Tooling was standardized. Workforce skills were transferable. This meant that mobilization did not require building an entirely new industrial base. It required redirecting an existing one. For planners accustomed to rigid separation between sectors, this adaptability was unsettling. The cultural dimension of American industry also drew attention. Initiative at lower levels was not merely tolerated, but encouraged. Engineers and managers were expected to identify inefficiencies and propose solutions without waiting for directives from above. This decentralization accelerated improvement in ways that centralized systems struggled to match. While mistakes occurred, they were treated as part of a learning process rather than ideological failures. Over time, this produced an environment where incremental gains accumulated into substantial advantages. In internal discussions, some Soviet economists argued that such flexibility came at the cost of control, that market forces could not be trusted in moments of crisis. Yet the evidence suggested otherwise. Historical precedent showed that American industry had repeatedly responded to emergencies with speed and coordination. During World War II, production levels once thought impossible had been achieved in remarkably short timeframes. The Cold War era merely refined those capabilities, embedding them into peacetime operations rather than reserving them for emergencies alone. The concept of deterrence began to take on a broader meaning. Nuclear weapons dominated headlines, but industrial capacity underpinned their credibility. Missiles required maintenance. Warheads required replacement. Delivery systems required continuous refinement. An economy capable of sustaining these demands indefinitely possessed a form of quiet dominance. This reality did not lend itself to dramatic displays, but it exerted constant pressure on adversaries forced to consider long-term sustainability. As years passed, the cumulative effect of these observations became harder to ignore. Attempts to replicate American efficiency through reforms within the Soviet system encountered structural limitations. Incentives could be adjusted, but without genuine competition, improvements plateaued. Investments were made, but misallocation remained a persistent problem. The gap did not disappear. It stabilized at a level that favored the United States. For American workers, this advantage was rarely framed in strategic terms. They clocked in, performed their jobs, and went home. Yet collectively, their productivity formed a foundation of national power as tangible as any military installation. The reliability of supply chains, the predictability of output, and the capacity for rapid scaling all contributed to a strategic environment in which American planners could afford patience. Time increasingly was on their side. The end of the Cold War would eventually validate many of these quiet assessments. Economic strain, compounded by systemic inefficiencies, played a decisive role in the unraveling of the Soviet Union. While political decisions and social pressures were critical, they unfolded against a backdrop of industrial disparity that limited available options. The ability to produce consistently, adapt quickly, and sustain effort over decades proved decisive. Looking back, the factory tours and technical exchanges of the mid-century period take on new significance. They were moments when ideology met reality, when assumptions were tested against steel, machinery, and logistics. The impressions formed in those environments shaped strategies that influenced global outcomes. What was seen could not be unseen. American industrial power did not rely on secrecy. It was visible, measurable, and repeatable. Its strength lay not in singular achievements, but in patterns. Patterns of organization, investment, and adaptation. These patterns persisted across administrations, economic cycles, and social change. They represented continuity in a world defined by uncertainty. The lesson often overlooked is that dominance is rarely accidental. It is built through countless decisions made far from the spotlight. Decisions about infrastructure, education, standards, and incentives. In the Cold War, these choices accumulated into an advantage that proved durable even under pressure. When rival systems were forced to confront this reality directly, the outcome became increasingly difficult to contest. In the end, the story of American industrial strength during the Cold War is not merely one of comparison, but of consequence. It demonstrates how economic foundations shape geopolitical possibilities. It reminds us that power is sustained not only by what a nation can destroy, but by what it can create, again and again at scale, without hesitation. What those Soviet visitors witnessed that day could not be explained away as exaggeration or theater. It was real, measurable, and undeniable. Endless assembly lines, precision at scale, a system designed not merely to compete, but to sustain dominance over time. In that moment, the Cold War stopped being theoretical and became painfully tangible. These encounters rarely made headlines, but they mattered. Because wars are not won only on battlefields. They are won in factories, in logistics, and in the quiet understanding of who can outproduce, outlast, and adapt. The realization that American industry could do all three left a mark that echoed far beyond that single visit. Stories like this remind us that history is often shaped by moments few people ever see. A look exchanged on a factory floor, a silent calculation, a recognition that the gap was far wider than expected. If you found this story insightful, let us know in the comments. Your perspective adds to the conversation. Check the description for useful links and sources related to this topic, and consider sharing this video with others who enjoy thoughtful, long-form history. Thank you for spending this time with Cold War Archives. More stories like this are coming. Stories about power, perception, and the unseen forces that shape the modern world.